The Trump administration is expected to reimpose sanctions on Iran today. The measures target automobiles, precious metals, and certain Iranian products like carpets and pistachios. The renewed sanctions come after President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal in May. Over the weekend, thousands of Iranians took to the streets to protest the country's weak economy. It remains unclear just how these new sanctions will impact daily life there, though. For more now on this, we want to bring in Behnam Ben Taleblu. He's a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he's joining me now from Washington. Behnam, thanks a lot for joining me. So let's talk about this reimposition of sanctions. The Trump administration actually suggested, or Trump suggested, that he be willing to meet with Iranian officials to negotiate a better deal. So what do you make of this strategy of reimposing the sanctions? Is this a way to get Iranian leadership to the negotiating table? It worked for North Korea.
Well, I think it's exactly right, and great to be back with you. The goal is to escalate massive pressure on the Iranian economy in a broad-based fashion, targeting sectors of that country that are owned or controlled by the notorious Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, diminish oil revenues, and to put the regime to a fundamental choice: to continue its malign activities or to come back to the negotiating table in good faith and discuss not just the nuclear issue, but the broad array of threats we face from Iran, from the region, ballistic missiles, terrorism, and whatnot.
So here's the other thing. You know, every time we hear the Secretary of State talk about Iran, it certainly sounds like he's pushing towards regime change. He's often encouraging the people in Iran to sort of rise up and pressure the government. And we've seen basically nonstop protests in the streets, becoming sort of more and more spirited as the months go on. Is regime change an actual possibility in Iran?
Regime change is a possibility by virtue of the Iranian people seeking it, not necessarily because Washington or another capital would decide to make that their de facto or de jure Iran policy. If you look at the 12 points Secretary Pompeo gave back in May, the bulk of them, if not all of them, dealt with Iranian foreign and security policy. And those measures are what Western sanctions are tied to. Now, I would call Pompeo a champion of the Iranian people. In fact, he addressed the Iranian American community at the Reagan Library recently. But those developments going on in Iran are indigenous and natural and specific to the context in that country, which is the chasm that is growing between state and society. And while there are a lot of economic grievances, people are distinctly manifesting their protest in political ways. And that's why the regime, I think, is afraid.
So Iran has increased its military drills in the Persian Gulf over the past week. U.S. officials believe that this is a show of force ahead of today's sanctions. The U.S. and Iran both have troops on the ground in Syria and other parts of the world. Will these sanctions have an impact on U.S. military operations, do you think?
Well, with respect to CENTCOM in the Middle East, CENTCOM's mission remains focused on actually the counter-ISIS campaign, and their force posture is what deters Iran. Now, given the theaters you mentioned, the Persian Gulf and Syria, we do operate in the same space as the Iranians, as well as their militias and proxies. So that means Iran does have options for escalation against us. But if you really look at those theaters, escalation by Iran or its proxies in Iraq and Syria is highly localized. It means it's depending on the battlefield conditions. The Persian Gulf is totally different, and the Persian Gulf is where we could see an accident lead to a confrontation. However, it is worth noting that in 2018, according to President Trump and the U.S. Navy, there have been 0 harassment attacks in the Persian Gulf, and that follows a downward trend since the president came into office.
So here's the thing about the reimposition of sanctions. The U.S. was only one of a number of countries signing on to this Iran deal. In order to reimpose sanctions, it will also mean that the U.S. will have to impose sanctions on businesses from our ally countries that are doing business in Iran, right? So what do you foresee will be the fallout from that? That's got to have an impact on the U.S.
Well, I think currently there will be a bit of a diplomatic fallout, and most of those countries, particularly the EU countries, had been working with the U.S. to try to find a way to fix the nuclear agreement. But once the president withdrew in May and the sanctions waiver deadline lapsed, I think there was a lot of bad blood and a bit of a transatlantic tiff, if you will, between the EU and the U.S. But if you look at the real drivers here, which are the banks and businesses headquartered in the EU, there has been a massive exodus of those banks and businesses from Iran since President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal on May 8th. And while there may be political animosity, I think economically you're beginning to see firms shift more towards Washington than Brussels or Tehran. How this plays out remains to be seen, because the European Union will remain a jurisdiction open to doing business with Iran, but those private businesses themselves simply choose not to.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much, Behnam.
Thank you.